Not that they don't know. I mean, governments are extremely well briefed. Their leading officials make sure that they're in contact with all the leading organisations in the country, particularly sort of business and certainly the oil industry, which is so important. They will have talked exhaustively about this. So it's not as though they don't know, and it's not as though the leaders are not briefed. Of course they are.
If you're a politician in a country that matters, and you say, I've got a concern about oil depletion, what's your next sentence? What do you say after that? You've essentially just said, the world as you know it is going to end. End of, and that's all we have today. I mean, you really have to be able to follow up with some sense of some policy, some solution, because there really is no easy solution at hand. Politicians are really loath to get into the whole notion of depletion. You can't raise a problem unless you've got a solution at hand. I mean, that's kind of the rule of politics, unless you're criticizing your opponent. And so no one really wants to raise the notion of depletion.
Of course, one would expect the politicians across the world to have begun to get together to talk about the implications and what each of them needs to do in order to deal with this threat. I suspect the reason that doesn't happen is because the United States, the far and away the most powerful country of the world, has decided that it doesn't want to convene an international conference to discuss how it's going to be shared out. What they have decided to do, pretty clearly from invading Iraq and trying to control oil from the Caspian Basin, which is the second largest repository of oil that is left in the world, is to try and monopolize for themselves the supply of this oil, because oil is power.
Without cheap oil, the American empire would never come about.
The mainstream media, I think, have done an abysmal job of reporting on the events of 9/11, on peak oil, and other things that really impact our lives. I mean, the average person knows much more about the personal habits of Brad Pitt than they know about peak oil and what's going to affect their life in the near future. I mean, if they don't have food to eat, if they don't have a job, that's something they need to know about beforehand. That's something they need to prepare for. And peak oil is the event of our lifetimes. It's going to dwarf anything that any of us has experienced in our lives up to this point, and yet we're told virtually nothing about it. The same thing with 9/11. I mean, here was the great political event, so-called terrorist event of our lifetimes. The world has changed profoundly as a result of it, and yet there's absolutely no real investigative reporting about it in the mainstream media. Instead, we have a lot of very courageous, independent investigative journalists who find it impossible to get their work published in the mainstream. It's a disastrous situation. There's a lot of circumstantial bits and pieces that when you add them up together paint a pretty persuasive picture, I think. The CIA's been studying the phenomenon of oil peaks since the 1970s. And Dick Cheney, former CEO of Halliburton, the world's foremost oil services company, has talked about the difficulty that the oil industry will have in meeting demand by the end of the first decade of the 21st century. Now, what happened after 9/11? Well, of course, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan and used that occasion to build military bases throughout the region of Central Asia, which is the new oil production region. Lots of new oil discoveries there in, coincidentally, 2000 to 2001. And then to invade Iraq, one can't help but see a pattern here. It seems evident to me that that 9/11 was in effect a kind of pretext for the U.S. to expand its military hold on the two most important oil-producing regions of the planet.
There are a number of elites, number of very influential policy advisors, a lot of people who went on to form part of the administration knew that peak oil was coming. They knew that they would not be able to survive peak oil without having this massive militarization of policy, and thirdly, that they needed to do that on the back of a drastic attack or perception of a threat in invasion to the United States, and this is what 9/11 provided.